The story of Jesus' healing of this man born blind is very familiar. It's unique to John, but it's a story that's very powerful. We start off in John 9 and verse 1 with these words, "And when Jesus passed by, he saw a man which was blind from birth." Now, we know from the context here, if you go back to the 8th chapter, verse 56 of John 8, "Your father Abraham rejoiced to see my day," Jesus said, "and he saw it and was glad. And then said the Jews unto him, Thou art not yet 50 years old, and hast thou seen Abraham? And Jesus said unto them, Verily I say unto you, before Abraham was, I am. And they took up stones to cast at him. But Jesus hid himself and went out of the temple, going through the midst of them, and so passed by." So Jesus is in the temple area, and he encounters this fellow, a man born blind. A man I think later we find out is begging, it seems. It's very familiar, or very similar, I should say, to the story over in Acts chapter 3. Acts chapter 3, we find, Peter and John at the temple. There was a certain man lame from his mother's womb, laid daily at the gate of the temple, which was called Beautiful, to ask alms of them that entered into the temple. And you remember that story. So here's a man born blind, and he's begging, it seems, begging alms there at the temple. That's where Jesus encounters him. Think about a first century fellow. Here's a man who's blind in first century Jerusalem. His prospects be pretty grim. They don't have any government programs for him. No Social Security. I suppose his parents would take care of him as long as they could, and then after that, he's just, he doesn't have any prospects of employment. He's in a very bad way. And so here's a man whose future did not look bright. But here's the point of the lesson, and we hope to emphasize this. God has plans for him. Even a man as disadvantaged as he was and was all he was facing, God had a plan for him. And I think that personal view that God has for men and how God is able to work in the lives of men no matter what they face is I hope, an encouraging thought for us. Let's continue in verse 2 of John 9. The disciples asked him, saying, Master, who did sin, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus answered, Neither this man sinned nor his parents, but that the works of God should be manifest in him. It's a remarkable passage, and one that I'm sure we puzzled over through the years. But there's something very typical about this. People see somebody who's had a bad turn, and they, maybe even religious people, naturally wonder, well, now, who exactly was it that sinned? Where can we put the blame? Who can we blame for this? Well, I think in the ultimate sense we can blame the devil, because I think it was through sin that so much tragedy, heartache, corruption, disease, mortality came into the world. And I think the devil acts sometimes more specifically than that. The story of Job is a great example of that, where the devil sent all kind of trouble specifically to Job. But here's the fact, God allowed it, did he not? He did allow it. He allowed it in Job's case. You can do this, but not this. You can go this far, but not farther. And so they want to know, what is it that's caused this condition? And the Lord's answer is, it's not the sin of this man or anybody else in any direct way that's caused this, but that the works of God should be manifest in him. I think it's too far for me to say that God caused this man to be born blind. He allowed it to be so, but he had a plan for this man. Notice other translations and how they work with this passage. The American Standard Version reads, Jesus answered, Neither this man did sin, nor his parents, but that the works of God should be manifest in him. The Bible in Basic English says, It was so that the works of God might be seen openly in him. It wasn't, the CEV paraphrase reads, but because of his blindness you will see God work a miracle for him. The Net Bible reads, Jesus answered, neither this man nor his parents sinned. He doesn't mean they never sinned, but that's not the reason why this is what it is his point. But that he was born blind so that the acts of God may be revealed through what happens to him. Here's a key lesson. God can take our troubles and turn them into a blessing for us and other people. And I think this man's story is that story. And I think there's a lesson for me and you to learn from that. Let's continue reading. After that remarkable statement that he makes, look in verse 4. Jesus continues, I must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. The night comes when no man can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. He says about this man has a part of the plan of God, and God has plans for him. But I tell you, all of this is time limited. Jesus said, I am the light of the world, and all glory comes through him, and all glory goes to him. But he made this point that was, when I act in the world, I must act now, because opportunities pass. That's why he was so urgent about what was to come. Now is the time for me to be here and to do what I was called to do by my Father. And certainly if the Lord felt that way, if he felt like the day was drawing to a close and now's the time to act, surely you and I ought to have that same kind of sense about our work. That our work is time sensitive, that our window of opportunity is closing. That God has given us this life and whatever troubles and obstacles we have, and it's my job to work with them now. And not to sit back and feel like, well, there's nothing for me, and not to say one day. It's a powerful lesson the Lord taught in his answer to their question. Well, look in verse 6. Here's the miracle. And when he had thus spoken, he spat on the ground and made clay with a spittle. And he anointed the eyes of the blind man with the clay. And then he said, go and wash in the pool of Siloam, which is by interpretation sent. And he went his way therefore and washed and came seeing. Don't you love the simplicity of the way John describes this? You know, if men, uninspired men had written this account, boy, it'd been 12 chapters long, wouldn't it? They would have talked about every little detail, and they'd talked about all kinds of things that we might be interested in, but are not relevant. Here's the relevant part of the story. The Lord intended to heal this man, and he did so. It involved the pool of Siloam. By the way, you know the pool of Siloam is still there? I mean, it's in ruins, and it's been covered over through the years. They've uncovered part of the steps, and part at least of the pool. This is the pool that was fed by the work that Hezekiah did from the spring Gihon. At one time, it looked more impressive. And it was well known by everybody in Jerusalem. It was intended to be originally a reservoir, a water source, if Jerusalem was, and it certainly was, attacked from outside, that the people would have a source of water. If you remember the map of Jerusalem, you think about the Temple Mount up here and the city of David down below, and then this would be, let me see, this is looking to the east, and so just to the west, down here in the lower city, would have been the pool of Siloam. This spring-fed pool was important strategically, and it was important in the daily life of members of the citizens of Jerusalem, I should say. In our story, I just think about how in the world did he get from the temple down to the pool? Here's this blind man. I don't know. Somebody might have helped him. But anyway, it took quite an effort. Jesus had made that mud and put it on his eyes and told him to go to Siloam. Everybody knew where Siloam was. And he makes his way somehow from around the temple all the way down here to this pool. Jesus said, wash. He washed. And then Jesus said, rather than the blind man saw as a result of his obedience. What you have here is another great example in the Bible of a conditional gift of God. This was a miracle. There was nothing magic about the mud. There was nothing magic about the water of Siloam. All of this, what was the trappings behind the power of God. But understand this. It was necessary for this man to obey to receive the gift. And it would have taken some amount of faith to make that long trek from the temple down to that pool just on the basis of a man we don't even know, who tells us, if you do this, it will bless you. And he believed him and obeyed him. There's a great lesson here from this man about obedience. He was the beneficiary of a miracle. You know, he didn't do this. God did. But it was his faithful obedience that allowed God to heal him. What's interesting next is, as you continue to read the story, the reaction to this miracle. Go back to John 9 and verse 8. The neighbors, therefore, and they which before had seen him that was blind, said, Is this not he that sat and begged? And some said, This is he. And others said, He is like him. But he said, I am he. Well, he ought to know. Therefore they said to him, How were thine eyes opened? And he answered and said, A man that is called Jesus made clay, anointed mine eyes, and said to me, Go to the pool of Siloam and wash. And I went and washed and received sight. Then said they unto him, Where is he? He said, I don't know. You know, it's evident he didn't really understand who Jesus was. Not everybody did in the first century. Even Jesus and his preaching and teaching, not everybody knew who he was. Certainly some did. But here's a man who seems to grow in his knowledge and understanding of Jesus as he encounters him along and along. He comes to realize this man is something special. And eventually he comes to full faith. But I tell you, one thing he was willing to do even now is to proclaim his name and give him credit and say, I am blessed because of this man, Jesus. I tell you, I need to have that same kind of courage. Speak up where you work. Speak up where you go to school. You know, tell them about what Jesus has done for you, and don't be ashamed of the name. And by the way, here's the critical thing. Don't live in such a way as you're contrary to what you're claiming. Now, I can't let things come out of my mouth that are ungodly and then turn around and talk about Jesus. That does more harm than good, and people know it's not true. But live in such a way that it's consistent for us to talk about the good things that Jesus has done for us. Notice as we continue here in chapter 9 and verse 13. They brought him to the Pharisees. The neighbors say, This is something. This is amazing. A man born blind now sees. Take him to the religious leaders, the Pharisees, the chiefest sect among the Jews. It was the Sabbath day, verse 14 says, when Jesus made clay and anointed his eyes. By the way, you notice how many times Jesus healed on the Sabbath day? You ever wonder about that? You know, you think he was just trying just to irritate the Pharisees? No, I don't think that's why he did that. This is another lesson. But, you know, if you go back and look at the history of the Sabbath day, from the very start, the Lord made the point with Israel. He said, this is a sign of liberty. This is a sign of your freedom. You're no longer slaves in Egypt. Now you got a day off. A day not just to be idle, but a day to devote to me. But a day when you step away from the daily routine. It's also a test of faith that I'll bless you even so. But it was associated with liberty. You remember that there was a Sabbath day, there was a Sabbath year, and that the year after 7 Sabbath years was a jubilee. All of this goes back to the concept of Sabbath. And it's the idea that we are made free. Now, what do you suppose that's that's pointing toward. It was the work that Christ came to do to make us free from sin. It's the hope we have of the eternal rest in heaven. So when the Lord would loose people, as he would say, from their infirmity, whatever it might be, in this case, to open the eyes of the blind on the Sabbath day, it was absolutely perfect. It was the right time to do it. All the Pharisees could see is that's some kind of work and there's no work on the Sabbath. The Lord said, you let your donkey, you pick him out of or help him out of a ditch if he was caught there on the Sabbath day. You understand that loosing an animal is an act of mercy. You understand this likewise is an act of mercy. It's perfectly appropriate for the Sabbath. Anyway, but they're going to make a deal about that, obviously. It was the Sabbath day. Verse 15 now. And then said the Pharisees also unto this man, ask him that had received his sight, how that had happened, how he had received his sight. And he said to them, he put clay upon mine eyes, and I washed, and I do see. And now there were some, even among the Pharisees, who struggled to condemn this. Therefore, verse 16, said some of the Pharisees, this man is not of God, because he keeps not the Sabbath day. But others said, how can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? And there was a division among them. That's a good point that they had. Verse 17. They said unto the blind man again, what sayest thou of him, that he hath opened thine eyes? He said, he's a prophet. This man formerly blind had enough sense to know this man is no sinner. He's no rebel against God. He has to be working with God. Otherwise, this great miracle couldn't be done. Well, there are some great lessons to be made there too. Not everybody's willing to receive God. Some, despite all evidence, will reject him. Again, it's another lesson, but it's a very dangerous thing when you start rejecting evidence. It's a very dangerous thing when you tell yourself, well, I know this is right, but I'm not going to obey it. I'm not going to respond to it. Over in Mark chapter 3, the Lord had the most stern of warnings to his enemies, who actually were so hardened they could look at the miracles he was doing, the casting out of demons, and attribute that to the work of the devil. Mark chapter 3 and verse 22, the scribes which came down from Jerusalem said, he hath Beelzebub, talking about Jesus, and by the prince of devils he cast out devils. And he called them unto him and said unto them in parables, how can Satan cast out Satan? And if a kingdom be divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house be divided against itself, that house cannot stand. And if Satan if Satan rise up against himself and be divided, he cannot stand, but hath an end. No man can enter into a strong man's house and spoil his goods, except he will first bind the strong man, and he will spoil his goods. Obviously, if you see a victory over the work of Satan, you know Satan didn't do it. Verily I say to you, he says in verse 28, all sins shall be forgiven of the sons of men, and blasphemies whithersoever they shall blaspheme. But he that shall blaspheme against the Holy Ghost hath never forgiveness, but is in danger of eternal damnation. And verse 30 gives us this explanation. Because they said he hath an unclean spirit. That's what he's saying here. Here are people so hardened that they would attribute uncleanness to the Holy Spirit. Now, the point is, even in John, here they see the miracle and they cannot be honest about the obvious lesson of that miracle. Now, that's a dangerous place to be. Don't let yourself feel good about rejecting the evidence of God. Now, the parents come into play. Back in our text in John 9, in verse 18. The Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight. Well, obviously he sees. Well, maybe he never was blind. So they call his parents and they ask them, is this your son who you say was born blind? How does he see? And you remember the parents answered and said, verse 20, we know this is our son. We know he was born blind. But by what means he now sees, we know not. Or who hath opened his eyes, we know not. He is of age, ask him, he shall speak for himself. That's sad because it really was not honest. Verse 22 says, these words spake his parents because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess that he was the Christ, he would be put out of the synagogue. Therefore, said his parents, he's of age, ask him. You know, there are people who are not willing to receive Jesus because of fear. You know, we'd say these people were afraid of what would happen. They're not hardened like those Pharisees. Yeah, but no is still no. And if we're just afraid to say yes to God, that's no better in effect as if we just are so proud and arrogant we're not going to bow to Jesus. It's all no. And it's a great reminder to us that there's only one answer to Jesus, and that is yes. You know, do not fear men who are able to kill the body but not able to kill the soul, Matthew 10:28. But rather fear him who is able to destroy both soul and body in hell. Are you afraid to let people know? Are you afraid to take a stand? I think about that statement in Revelation 20 and verse 8. Revelation 2 and verse 8 I'm trying to say. This is the letter to the church at Smyrna. And it seems to me as we look at our own society and the dark clouds on the horizon, this letter might mean more and more to us in days to come. The Lord sends this message to the church at Smyrna. Unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. I know thy works and tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. And I know the blasphemy of them that say they are Jews and are not, but of the synagogue of Satan. Fear none of those things which thou shalt suffer. Behold, the devil shall cast some of you into prison, that you may be tried, and ye shall have tribulation 10 days. Be thou faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life. He doesn't promise to these beloved, now you won't really suffer. He doesn't promise, they won't throw you into jail. He says, whatever comes when it happens, if they kill you, pay the price. Hold to me. Don't you sell me out. Don't you give up on your faith. There's a part of us that wants to feel for these parents who in their fear cowered. But I don't think the Lord cuts them any slack. Let's go back to our text. Round 2 of the enemies, John 9, verse 24. So having gotten no help from the parents particularly, they come back to the man, these enemies of Jesus do, this man formerly blind, and they say to him again, give God the praise. We know this man is a sinner. Really? Whether he be a sinner or no, I don't know, but I know one thing. I was blind and now I see. Well, how did he open your eyes? He said, I've already told you and you didn't hear. Would you hear it again and be his disciple? Oh, we're Moses' disciple. You're his disciple. We are Moses' disciple. We know where Moses came from. We don't know where this fellow comes from. He said, it's an amazing thing to me. A marvelous thing, as the old translation says. You know not from whence he is, and he has opened mine eyes. Now we know that God hears not sinners. If any man be a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, was it not heard that a man opened the eyes of everyone born blind? If this man were not of God, he could do nothing. You know how they answered him? They said, you're just a sinner. You're just one of the riffraff. What are you going to teach us? And they cast him out. Verse 34 says they cast him out. What's interesting is that here's this man on what ought to have been the most happy day of his life. For the first time in his life he can see. Can you imagine what he was going through, all of the emotions of being, you've never seen before. First time you've ever seen a person. First time you've ever seen a tree, the sun, the sky. And you think about what ought to have been the happiest day of his life, and he's being bombarded and pressured and pushed by the devil through these men into denying the source from which the miracle came. I've known people who were baptized and received forgiveness of sins, and they didn't get out of the water hardly before people started putting pressure on them to compromise and deny and quit and turn back. And I'll tell you something that I found to be true. For me, that was a long time ago that I was baptized. I can't claim that I had all that trouble immediately. I had a lot of encouragement. But I know this, I know the devil has never let me alone yet. And I don't expect he ever will. I don't think he'll leave you alone. If you stand up for the Lord and you try to do what's right, you're going to serve him, the devil will make sure that one after another temptation will come to undercut you, to take you down. And what I admire about this man is the fact that he's willing to fight that fight. They cast him out. I don't know, the different translations offer different ideas about what might have been involved here. Did they excommunicate him, or did they just throw him out of their presence? Or if they did the worst, they did a great deal. They tried to shame him. They tried to intimidate him. But the fact is that through it all, he would not deny the Lord. And then in verse 35, we have this reunion. Jesus heard that they had cast him out. And when he found him, he said to him, "Dost thou believe on the Son of God?" And he said, "Who is he, Lord, that I might believe?" Verse 37 says, "Thou hast both seen him, and it is he that talks with thee." And he said, "Lord, I believe." The Lord wasn't bodily present with him through all of his trials, but he did not forget him. And he received him when he had taken his stand. He was not forgotten by Jesus. And I admire too this man's faith, that through all of his trials, his faith grew stronger and stronger. And when Jesus said, "I am the one," he had no problem saying, "I believe." He was ready to believe. His faith had been strengthened by the things he had been through. And Jesus challenges all in the last verses of this chapter. In verse 39, "For judgment I am come into the world, that they which see not might see, and they which see might be made blind." Some of the Pharisees which were with him heard these words, and they said to him, "Are we blind also?" He said, "If you were blind, you'd have no sin. But now you say, we see, therefore your sin remains." He said, "I've come for judgment." That word krino is a word which can suggest the idea of decision. Jesus comes and he forces a decision from every one of us. Let me say this personally. Everybody in this room has been forced to a decision by Jesus. We're either serving God today, serving him faithfully today, or we're playing at it, or we're not serving him at all. But I'll tell you, the Lord doesn't leave any middle ground. We're either with him or we're not. And all he accepts is that wholehearted service. And that's the Lord's effect on the whole world. I came for judgment. I came to force a decision. I came to bring the hearts of men to light. Good hearts like this former beggar, or those of the high and mighty who in fact were very far from God. Nothing gets you farther from God than a heart filled with pride will. And I think we sing that old song, "What will you do with Jesus?" Isn't that so? You know, he demands a verdict. And we'll give it one way or the other. It's our choice. But how inspired we are that this man made the right choice. Let me conclude as our time is up. The 10th chapter continues. Jesus preaches this great lesson on the being a good shepherd. There are a lot of things that we'd like to say about that we'll not at this point. But he makes the point, I'm the shepherd. The sheep belong to me. And I'm the loving shepherd, not a hireling. And I'm the door. All safety is through me. You're with me, you're safe. If you're not with me, then you're not. And he gives also in the 10th chapter a preview of his work. And here are people listening to this lesson. As he says in verse 15 of chapter 10, "As the Father knows me, even so I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And other sheep," he says, "I have which are not of this fold. Them also I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd. Therefore doth my Father love me, because I lay down my life that I might take it again. No man takes it from me. I lay it down of myself. I have power to lay it down. I have power to take it again. This command I have received of my Father. In these words, Jesus gives a preview of his work, his death, his resurrection, and of the salvation, not just of the Jew, but Jew and Gentile, all coming to one fold. It's a marvelous statement here. And so what is the reaction of the people as we draw the lesson to a close? Look in 19, 20, and 21. And there was a division again, therefore, among the Jews for these sayings. And many of them said, He hath a devil and is mad. Why hear ye him? And others said, These are not the words of him that hath a devil. Can a devil open the eyes of the blind? And that brings us right back to chapter 9. And the great effect that the faith of this man and the power of God, of course, who gets all the credit, had on many hearts. Here's a fellow at the first of the story, and we think, boy, it's terrible to be a guy like that. What a hopeless, useless life he's going to live. Best we can say is, hope it's a short life so you don't have to suffer long. Look at the blessing he was. Look at all the lives that were touched. Now, not everybody's going to respond positively or receive it. And so here's the point. We got folks that are facing troubles and trials, some near and some far. Some of those trials involve physical things, some of them involve financial things, some of them involve emotional problems, struggles, trials that we have. And the temptation is just to rein our horns in and say, woe is me, and there's just nothing here but misery and lament. If I do that, I forget what God can do. And how God took a man born blind who had lived some number of years with all the things that brought. But it did not sour and embitter his heart. And when he encountered the Son of God, he responded to him. And he's blessed not just the folks in this story, but all of us today, and so many millions through the years who've read this story. Don't forget what God can do with you and me, even in our troubles, even in the darkest times. If we're people who hold to God in faith, proclaim his name, don't deny him no matter what pressure comes on us, we might be shocked and amazed to think about the good that God can do with us. You don't have to be on top of things for God to use you. God used a man born blind. I hope that I don't forget that lesson, no matter what tomorrow may bring. I appreciate your kind attention. I invite you to take your songbooks and turn to the number that's been selected. Do you have an unshakable faith? Do you have a faith that will not quit? Do you have a faith that loves the truth no matter what? If you don't, you need that kind of faith. I do too. Because that's the only kind of faith God will really accept. So, come to him. Return to him. If you're one who's never confessed your faith in Christ, today'd be a great day to do that. To say, yes, I believe Jesus is the Son of God, and I want him to be my Lord. And I've lived long enough for myself, and I hate it, and I'm ashamed of it. And I believe that one who died on the cross is the one who now sits in heaven reigning. And I want to be his servant. I want to be buried like he was buried, baptized into Christ, raised to walk in newness of life. If you need to respond to the Lord, the same Lord that healed this blind man, he loves you. Love him. Come to him. And if we can help you, let us know while we stand.